All right. Welcome everybody to the panel Publishers and Platforms, State of Play. My name is Ingo Dachwitz. I'm a communication scholar and political journalist from Berlin. I work for Netzpolitik.org, an investigative non-profit news site. Also, I am co-author of the study Google the Media Patron. And also, I decided I'm way too nervous to not read out my introduction. So I hope you understand that I will be, for the couple of next minutes, might be looking more at this than looking at you. But yeah, I'm very happy to present this international panel on the status quo and future of the complex relationships between the news industry and the platform industry, together with Adrienne Fichter from Switzerland, political scientist and reporter for the online magazine Republik.ch and Swiss Investigative Journalist of the Year 2020 and 21. Congrats to that. Gilles Bruno from France. He runs the media watch blog L'Observatoire Médias and works at the Paris journalism school L'École des métiers de l'information. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And of course, Emily Bell, who was a longtime writer and online editor-in-chief at The Guardian and now is director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School in New York in the United States. Also, she is, among many other things, chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Advisory Council on Social Media and an advisor to the Tamedia Group in Switzerland. Yeah, really glad to have you all here. First things first, after introducing the panel, I want to use the chance to thank the International Journalism Festival for having us and for making space for this important topic. And I guess in this regard, I also should start thanking the generous sponsors of the whole event for making all this possible. So thank you to the Open Society Foundation. And well, thank you to Google, thank you to Facebook for making this possible. Which of course leads us direct to the topic of our panel. Over the last decade, Google and Facebook not only became the most important digital infrastructures for the distribution of news, for reader engagement and for digital ad monetization, but also have risen to be the biggest commercial donors to journalism. And while I'm very careful not to use the word philanthropy in this context, we have to admit they just hand out a lot of money to journalistic organizations and to the journalistic ecosystem as a whole. The trend started prominently with Google's digital news initiative in 2015-16, giving 140 million euro for innovation projects in European media organizations. Now there is the global Google News initiative equipped with $300 million and respectively the Facebook Journalism Project with the same amount of money. They give millions of dollars to support news organizations during the COVID pandemic. They sponsor journalist events like the IJF. They pay for fellowships for promising young journalists. They fund research and institutions like the Reuters Institute. They fund projects and technical solutions at publishers. They offer free trainings and tools for journalists and so forth. This, of course, adds another layer to the already complex relationship between platforms and publishers, and it prompted questions about the independence and autonomy of journalism in the digital age. It is a discussion that, again, also took place here at the International Journalism Festival. But for many years, these discussions here and elsewhere have been dominated by a narrative of news media as the old industry in a permanent process of decay and confronted with a significant loss of power, both economically and politically. Platform enterprises, on the other side, Facebook and Google most notably, seem to be unstoppable forces, disrupting and shaping industries, business models, and the public sphere itself, leaving media only with two choices, to adapt or to die. But maybe, just maybe, and this shall at least be my hypothesis for this discussion today, tides could be changing at least a little bit. At least we have seen some remarkable developments in the recent past. Not only do Google and Facebook come under more and more pressure for their duopoly in the digital ad market and for allegedly illegal market manipulation, but also we witnessed how the news industry used all their political powers to lobby for new laws. Laws that force intermediary platforms to pay license fees for using their content, with quite some success. The European Union introduced a thing called ancillary copyright for press publishers, or Leistungsschutzrecht für Presseerzeugnisse, how we call it in Germany, where the Axel Springer company invented this idea 10 years ago. It's a copyright law under which search engines and social media companies must pay fees to publishers when they want to display snippets of their content in their services. Similar to this, Australia adopted the News Media Bargaining Code, forcing platforms to go into license negotiations with publishers, which both led again to new strategies on the side of Google and Facebook, establishing their own licensing programs and new products, Google News Showcase in the past 2 years and Facebook News. And while we could spend a whole panel discussing if these new laws are good things or not, even many people outside the tech industry think they're problematic for some cause. I think what is most interesting about them is that they might signal a certain shift in power in a relationship that defines the future of our digital information ecosystem. So, lots of discuss for us today. And if it's true, what some people say, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, I think it's crucial to look out for it in different places and with different perspectives. This is why we want to start our panel with short reports on the status quo between publishers and platforms in the countries, in the United States, in France, in Switzerland, and in Germany. After all I know, I expect them to be quite different, although we have to keep in mind that with 4 Western countries, this obviously is only still a small portion of the worldwide news media reality. And I guess it would be lovely if someone from the audience might bring in later in the discussion perspectives that are missing so far on this panel. But for now, let's start with Emily Bell and the situation in North America. Yeah, so Emily, what are recent developments between platforms and the media in Northern America?
Thanks very much indeed, Ingo. Well, I'll sort of try and give a brief overview and say sort of North America. I want to include Canada in this because Canada, as some of you may know or may not know, has just introduced its own online news legislation, which very much mirrors the Australian News Media Bargaining Code in terms of introducing what we call a negotiate, arbitrate model, which is this idea. But the underlying principle is the same, that you will have 2 platforms that are bound by law to give money to the publishing industry for using links in their work. The situation in America is rather different. First of all, it's really interesting to me. I was chairing a panel on Friday at the International Society of Online Journalists in Austin, in Texas. And Steve Waldman, who chairs a coalition in the United States for rebuilding local news, was talking about whether or not there was actually any appetite for this kind of legislation in the United States. And he said, this is not something that we are pressing for, because a lot of the membership of the coalition to rebuild local news, which are local, these are local news organisations, are not in favour of it. So one thing that you might extrapolate from that is that actually Google and Facebook have been very, very effective in achieving 2 ends really in the United States. One of which is they have been the most generous and consistent funders of local newsrooms over the past probably about the past 5 years in the United States. They've also usually moved in lockstep with the other really big funder, which is the Knight Foundation. So maybe the fact that local newsrooms are not particularly in favour of lobbying for legislative reform may be a reflection of the fact that the American culture wants to see fixes coming from industry and the free market, or it could be that, if you cynically want to say this is lobbying money, it was lobbying money well spent. So one of the things which I think is interesting about the North American situation is that we see from certainly Australia, and I think we'll see it in Canada, I think Brazil is going to be next, that if you introduce legislation which formalises and to some extent enforces support for journalism from technology platforms, you will always get more money than if you leave it to philanthropy and just sort of, as it were, the kind of the good intentions or the impulses of either foundations or big businesses. So we're actually at a really interesting point in the States because, you know, COVID, we saw Town Centre Research, my colleague Gabby Miller was tracking every single newsroom layoff in the United States. We saw about 100 outlets shut, lost 6,000 and something jobs. So we know that actually the boom year that a lot of the bigger publishers have just experienced is definitely not experienced by everybody, that the smaller local publishers are still really suffering. The big question in all of this is, what should the role of non-journalistic private enterprises be in underpinning the world of underpinning the field of journalism? So I think at the moment we're in a situation where actually you have, ironically, the absence of policy and support around that, particularly in the United States, actually sort of the Google and Facebook to some extent have helped fill the policy vacuum, and their answer to this is equip newsrooms to raise their own money, particularly through subscriptions. It's not about lobbying for broad reform and regulated reform of the market. I think we're going to see a really interesting year where for the first time in America we actually have other legislation on the books to support journalism. To me, my centre takes not a penny from the platforms. I have to say they haven't actually offered. We research exactly what their effect on the field is, and we try and sort of apply a kind of a non-partisan, if you would, lens to what the balance of that relationship is. I think what's happened slowly over time, sort of just finish with this, is that almost without us realising it, I think we have this sort of illusion of independence of the media, which actually doesn't really exist. And I think the really big shift that has happened over the past decade is that we see now the control of distribution sort of really has totally shifted to the technology companies, that there is a genuine change in the control of the media. And so when we talk about mainstream media, really we're talking about the platforms now. You know, sort of this may not be how Fox News sees it, but actually, you know, that those are the deciders of what gets circulated and shown to whom. And I think that war in Ukraine is going to have a really big effect on how those platforms approach that responsibility that they now have to the public sphere and to journalism. I don't quite know how it's going to play out. Should we have more regulation? Should we leave it to the platforms, etc.? I've always been an advocate of formalising these arrangements under legislation. But I also recognise that I'm talking about America here, and that there are other parts of the world which, without the support of non-governmental actors, journalism would be in a much more dire position. So I guess what I would wish from the platforms is better regulation in countries where the regulation will actually help independent press. In the countries where it won't help independent press, if the platforms are really earnest in their endeavours, they now need to align their practices on the ground and their policies and their content moderation policies with supporting a free press, which at the moment they absolutely don't.
Thanks, Emily. Before we switch over to Gilles and the situation in France, just one quick question. You mentioned the power over the distribution. I mean, in Germany, the new products like Google News Showcase and Facebook News, they come with a rhetoric of giving power back to the publishers. Yeah, you can decide which content you show. How's the situation regarding those two products in the US? Are they established there?
Yeah, so we tend to get the products first. So, you know, for instance, we had Facebook News tab before, I think, you know, the rest of the world. And yeah, you know, I think there's a very healthy exchange of, but in the charmed circle, it should be said, of the publishers that are engaged with those platforms. If you want to forge an independent existence without the platforms, good luck in getting invited to their drinks or their newsgeists or whatever. You know, that's what I mean by these are not intrinsically sort of, you know, all you know, they're not all encompassing
Yeah.
sort of support systems. But we shouldn't just be talking about Google and Facebook anymore. I mean, you know, my students, not actually my students, but some undergraduates I've been teaching, get their news pretty much entirely from TikTok. These are not journalism students, I would hasten to add, but they are, you know, there are other platforms now moving into the space. And you should have seen the journalistic reaction to Elon Musk taking 10% of Twitter 2 days ago, which is just goes to show that one way or another, whatever we tell ourselves of the situation, we don't actually have much of a degree of independence.
As much as I agree, for this panel, I'd like us to stick a bit more to Facebook and Google, just because they are like the largest players. They are like the legacy players in this field.
Well,
also, they are
the advertising market. So.
Also, they are the ones who give the money for free. They are the biggest commercial donors. So, but still, I agree. Okay, over to you, Gilles. The situation in France, I guess it's, from what I know, quite different. The French public and the French publishers never had a problem with taking. Making the state make Google pay and Facebook pay, right?
Exactly. Buongiorno a tutti. We had, first of all, in France, we had this culture of accepting money from the state to help media. So, first of all, media for many years had some money from the state helping them. Because of all their problems. And then Google arrived and began to give money to many newspapers and media groups. And then you had this new law in 2019. So you can call it ancillary law. In French, we call it droit voisin, diritti vicini, neighboring laws, neighboring rights. So it's all that stuff about using links and news. And here in France, you had negotiations, but these negotiations with Google didn't went right. So what I mean is that there had been a deal. The amount of the deal was not public, but as we have some journalists working, we have some piece of information. And the amount is around 30 million euros per year, given to the newspapers, which are inside of like a group. What we say the press for general information. But this deal with this group named APIG was signed in January 2021. But once this this deal was signed, then there were bad news for Google in France, because Google was condemned to pay 500 million fine and the meaning of this fine was, okay, you did one deal, but the negotiation of this deal is not fair. So you have to discuss again with the media, and you have to find a solution. And in their decision, so the name of the thing is Autorité de la Concurrence, and they say that they were asking for all this money. And why they ask this money in a matter of, to be more precise. First of all, when they discussed, it was not only about neighboring rights, ancillary rights. Google said, okay, we're going to discuss about the rights, but meantime, we are launching a new product which is called Publisher Curated News, and inside this product you have the Google Showcase. So, okay, let's discuss, we're gonna give you some money, but you have to take our new product. You have to sign on that. So it's kind of always the same thing with Google. It's a fantastic company. They do a lot of really nice tools. But it's, okay, we are giving you some money, but you have to use this tool. And it will be really nice if you use this tool. Or, you know, it's going to be really difficult between us if you don't use this tool. So the discussions with Google is kind of tough. But I'm not going to be very precise on that because you have Google, so you can find some press articles about that. But I'm going to share you one piece of information. And maybe you didn't know that. I had the possibility to be invited at a Newsgeist event in 2018.
Which is a special
Yeah,
from Google organized.
I wanted to ask, do anyone know Newsgeists or not? Who knows it?
Some hands are
Please.
up, yeah. Quite
Okay,
some.
so not everybody. So Newsgeist is like a super private event made by Google. You cannot claim to be invited. There is not a public list of people invited. They invite people. And then it was in 2018 in Lisbon. They reserve a whole hotel, so you're between us, and it's editors, mainly. So you're between you, it's very private, and then you talk, and you talk. And the law in this event is, afterwards, you can write articles about what happened in this event. You can say what has been said, but you cannot say who said it. This is the law. They make you sign a paper saying that. And because of that, once you arrive in this event, you free yourself, and then you talk a lot. And you talk a lot, and at the end, you give a lot of information to who? To Google. And so I'm not going to tell who said that, but in this event, there was a small atelier talking about Google funding. And then one company, I'm not going to tell which company, one huge company said to the audience, to the small audience, well, you know, we don't know if Google funding for the press is going to be on next year. We don't know. And when I saw that, it was so violent, you know? It was so hard. So this company said that, and just afterwards, they went much more further, and they say out loud, you should talk about this. I mean, the law, in European law that was going to come in 2019, they say you should talk about that in your newspapers. So when they say that, I was looking with one of my colleagues, which was not a colleague, it was a lady, I mean, an editor really top, and she won't believe what she just said. And we were like, wow, this is so direct. So I'm going to be shorter. So the negotiation in France were kind of tough. And what can I can say that France and editors in France didn't comply at all about this, talk about this in your columns and all that stuff. They are taking the money from Google, It's 30 million per year. It's a little less from Facebook, 25 millions. But France fighted in groups. The little thing to know is many newspapers were together to fight together, but you had 3 newspapers that signed before some deals directly with Google, which is Le Monde, Le Figaro, and Libération daily newspapers. And so the story is not over, because now you also have a new enquête parlementaire about these rights. So we have elections, as you may know, on Sunday in France, and maybe that this subject is going to be on again, and maybe Facebook and Google are going to have new problems with French editors.
Thanks, Gilles. What I find really interesting about the situation in France is that maybe many people don't know that the prototype for the D&I fund, the first time Google decided, okay, we're setting up a fund, giving money to publishers, giving money to the press, that happened in France in 2013 or 14, I guess, because the French press and French politicians kept asking for a Google tax, something they wanted as a way of funding the news media. And then heads of state François Hollande and then heads of Google, Eric Schmidt, sat together and signed a deal. Okay, Google is giving $60 million fund to the €60 million fund to the French press, and after that we stopped talking about a Google tax.
Yeah, the Google fund in France was like they began with France, and then it was the model that inspired the
D&I.
The D&I, yeah.
Okay.
The D&I.
Over to you, Adrienne, and the situation in France. I hear in Switzerland, I hear many publishers are a bit more skeptical towards operating with the platforms there.
Yes, they are. So also buongiorno from my side. And maybe a little recommendation, maybe instead of using the search engine of Google, I would recommend another one like Startpage. You're getting better results sometimes, even. So, in Switzerland it's actually the same like in other countries. It's this typical frenemy relationship. Maybe you heard this term. It's like friends and enemy at the same time. You have all the tools, search engines, platforms from Google and Facebook. And there are a lot of workshops going on. There are also workshops in this festival. So they try to have a good relationship. The tech companies try to have a good relationship with the news companies. And on the other side, Google is also the enemy. Google is the reason why they have a big loss of advertising revenue in the last years, particularly in the last 12 years and also in the last years as well during the pandemic. So it's kind of, contradictory. But right now is, as you said, Ingo, there's a copyright discussion going on, and Switzerland is also eager to adapt this copyright reform of the EU with this ancillary copyright reform, so to make this taxation of the media article links, and the major publishers really hope they get now this funding, or they get now something back from this loss of advertising revenue. And that's why, that's kind of interesting, is that the major Swiss news companies are pausing their cooperations with Google they had. So there's just no, as far as I know, in one of my pieces, I was investigating this topic, and there was little conversation about Google News Showcase, and as far as I know, no one really wants to start this cooperation, and just kind of are waiting what's going on in the parliament with the copyright reform, which is totally different from 2019 and 2020 and 2018. So the Swiss media outlets were among the countries with most of the recipients of the other programs, like the Google News Initiative and Digital News Initiative. So this has changed, and media managers from all companies told me, we're going to wait and we will see. And also the Swiss media companies are kind of desperate because we just had a referendum in February about the media law, about public funding, and the majority of the people in Switzerland has said no to that, and so there is no state funding now of the media companies. So the situation is difficult for all major news companies which are relying on advertising revenue. And they hope to get something back by the copyright reform. That's why they're reluctant now to have deeper cooperations. But also, I'm not so sure that this ancillary copyright will pass in the parliament, because Google is also very, very strong with lobbying in the parliament. Google Switzerland has the biggest headquarter of Google outside of the United States. It's a very important employer in our country with 4,000 to 5,000 employees. And so if you come to Zurich once, you see this huge building next to the train stations this is all, all belonging to Google, and there will be more. So this is, I think the lobby of the publishers are kind of underestimating this effect, and they're very well and good connected to our deputies. And on the other hand, what I've seen is that the local media publishers and startups started to discover now the benefits from the Google funding. I discovered last year, just with some hints and also a little bit by accident, I discovered a sheet with a program called Journalism Emergency Relief Fund. And that is, and then I was searching the internet if there were some reporting about it, and there was little to zero reporting about it, because it was just an announcement from Google during the first wave in the pandemic. We're gonna distribute now money to all local media publishers, only local media publishers, and in this Excel sheet, then I found, of course, some Swiss publishers as well, 21. They all in all just got $200,000. And worldwide, Google was funding 5,600, was funding, I think, $39 million, and to 5,600 publishers worldwide. And that was striking me was it's just, there was no reporting about it. I just saw it by chance, and then I was asking the local media publishers in Switzerland, so how was the application? How did it work? And they just told me, we found this form, we just invested 1 hour. At the end, 1 month later, we got the money on our bank account. And there's just, maybe we have now a discussion about this program as well, but I just find it's interesting that now local media publishers with no advertising model, so it's not even something like, Google stole our advertising money and now we want to have it back. It's just like, for everyone, it's open for everyone. There are no criteria for selection. You don't know anything about the selection process as well. And I think this is now a shift, and it's also different from the programs before, where you had to submit an idea and say, I want to create a bot which is moderating the comment section of my media portal. And now you just need to apply within 1 hour, and 1 month later you get now the amount of money, and you don't even know why you got the money. It's just very intransparent. So this is now the change in Switzerland. The major news companies say, no, we're not gonna cooperating with Google. We just wait for regulation, if it's gonna happen. It's not clear yet. And the local media publishers, all I asked, they told me, I would do it again. It's just so easy way to get funding, very quick, and there's no bureaucracy at all.
Yeah, sorry, just on the Journalism Relief Fund, we did the Town Centre published some research at the end of 2020, and I think it was 262 million in total from all donors to 7,000 newsrooms. But exactly as you say, these are quite small sums, but we talked to some of the newsrooms, nobody everybody just applied, gets the money, doesn't get the money. It's it was a slightly larger sum of money in total.
Yeah. Okay. Quick look to Germany. I'm trying to make this really quick. First thing, Google News Showcase and Facebook News are well established in Germany. We can say that. In Germany, it was one of the first countries where Google launched Google News Showcase, and most of the bigger publishers and also many smaller publishers take part in this. Except for prominently Axel Springer, who oppose taking, at least in this regard, money from Google and Facebook. But if you talk to publishers, they say, okay, it's nice that we have this product. We'd like to take the licensing money we get out of this, but it's a crappy product. It doesn't help us reach an audience. We don't get proper analytics from Google and Facebook. Last summer, some German publishers I spoke to, they didn't even know if if Facebook News already launched in Germany or not. They received the money, but they didn't know if the product was really in the market already. So yeah, this happened. Then German market authorities are investigating Google News Showcase. This is why Google, for example, already announced that they wouldn't. They had a clause in the contract for Google News Showcase which obliged publishers not to take money from any other licensing thing, like the ancillary copyright, if they take part in Google News Showcase. But they kind of decided not to enforce this because the market authorities are investigating it. And yeah, then there's obviously the ancillary copyright, which I guess we will see some interesting lawsuits in the upcoming years. Médias, which is one of the prominent defenders of the ancillary copyright, and also they claim to represent 1/3 of the German news media industry. They already announced that they would be suing Microsoft and Facebook most probably for not complying and not paying enough money under the ancillary copyright. Also, they're not at all happy with what Google is paying. So this organization, they made an estimation that Google would have to pay 400 million euros per year. Google offered 3 million. Okay, so they will have to meet somewhere in between, I guess. This is going to be interesting. Okay, that's maybe so much from Germany, just to keep it short. I guess one thing we can establish after those reports is that Google and Facebook are some kind of indispensable partners, infrastructure providers for the news industry. I haven't seen that much opposition to it.
That's one of the things that I find most troubling about the current legislation. I also forgot to mention the JCPA, which is the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act in the US, which allows collective bargaining by publishers with technology companies for payment. Google and Facebook are not specified. Also, I'm reluctant to mention any tabled legislation in the United States because the chances of it passing or ever moving through Congress is like getting a bowling ball through a snake. So, but yes, so the fact that these bills tie the future of journalism to big platforms, actually I think is fundamentally the biggest problem with them, is that actually, is that an appropriate relationship to be encouraging? And maybe, but as you say, that what surprised me is that there's very little opposition on that basis, because I think the publishers are not really pushing back on that. And civil society doesn't really nobody outside academic researchers and investigative journalists are looking at it and saying, actually this might be quite a bad idea. That's my sort of sense from the States.
What I wanted to say is that one of the many problems of the press and media is not working together. I mean, the media, the different outlets and groups. And we have an example in France with a Google technology and wanted to be a French technology. At the same event in 2018 in Lisbon, I talked about one tool that was going to, it was the beginning of this tool. This tool in France name was Médias, and the purpose of this tool was to log in, a central login, so you had one login, and then you could log in on Le Figaro, L'Équipe, Libération, so many newspapers. So you had a group, they began to work on that, and just at the beginning of this work, I went to an event organized by Le Geste, who was managing this tool, and I just asked one question. I said, you talked about this newspaper, but what about Le Monde? Is Le Monde getting this new tool? And they said no. So once I had this answered, I was like, okay, it's not going to work. And it didn't work. It didn't work. So a little few newspapers put this tool online. The other one who were in the group said, we are going to, but we are not ready yet. And in the same time, you had Google working on subscribe with Google. So with the amount of people that just have, like you and me, a Google account with Gmail and maybe paying a little because we have too much emails, so we pay to keep these emails so they have our bank account number. So then when you use subscribe with Google, is super fast, super easy, and it's 95% of the amount who is for the media. So to say that is that because of lack of technology shared between newspapers and the lack of work between media, you can have problems like that, which are solved by huge big tech companies. So media has to spend a lot of money on technology, more and more, to have maybe less problems.
I guess the point is publishers really made it easy for Google and Facebook to fill in there because they kind of there was a lack of
I just want
innovation.
I want to defend publishers here. Right. So I think publishers have been really innovative. I mean, I ran kind of the website of The Guardian between 2000 and 2010. We innovated like crazy people, and lots of European publishers have been enormously innovative when you compare to other industries. But it's impossible. It's that Google News was a product built on top of hundreds of millions of dollars that came from investors and venture capital funds that was never available to legacy news organizations. If you actually look at how some of the sort of larger legacy news organizations have innovated, whether you look at the New York Times, which is, I have to say, universally hated in the United States for its enormous success. You look at sort of things achieved by the BBC or the Guardian or sort of European publishers. Lots and lots of kind of innovation in Germany. I think I don't think it's really our fault, because I think it's really hard to do that type of innovation and do good journalism at the same time. Yes. They are really, really different disciplines. And one of the things which I think we need to sort of get past is, can we have more regulation and transparency to allow us to use these available technologies without it being compromising? Because I do not like, we're just talking to a colleague about the metaverse on the way up here, and saying we don't want to go back to evening news bulletins where 80% of the budget is spent on production and 20% is spent on journalism. So when I'm trying to look at the good side of this bargain, deal with the devil, Faustian pact, whatever you want to call it, it would be that at some point journalists are able to use technologies that they're not compromised by and invest more in actual journalism. And I'm not saying you can't do both. I'm just saying it's really, really, really hard to do both, and you can't beat, you know, multi-billion-dollar technology companies at sustainable technology.
I would agree on that, and also I think what you said before is Google doesn't want publishers to work together as well. It's highly intransparent, all these bilateral deals, as far as what I heard from conversations with media managers. So everyone has its own partnership conversation. If it's, I don't know, Google News Showcase or all the other programs and products they work about. So, and the same was also now with this emergency relief fund. When I talked to the local publishers, they said, yeah, I had this contact person there, contact person this, and everyone had some different arrangements, you know, some different deals at the end. And so I think they really manage that the publishers are really, at the end, not working together and have a common position and go there to the negotiations. And this login alliance, just briefly, it's basically in Switzerland, we also have this attempt of having a common login for everyone, and it's still not in charge, it's still planned since years. And then they had this alliance, and now another publisher said, oh no, maybe I will now use the Google product, how is it called? The sign in with Google? Subscribe with Google, exactly. Now, this participant now dropped out and there's a new one. So I think this will never be in charge because Google is just too strong and really have regular meetings with all kinds of media managers all the time. So they really don't want people to work together.
But it works. For example, Louis Dreyfus from Groupe Le Monde shared some month ago that Subscribe with Google was giving like 12% of the new subscriptions, online digital subscriptions. So it's a lot. So it's working. Of course it's working. But,
well, no, I mean, so I think that the problem is if you spend money on innovation within your own technology in the newsroom, you're so dependent now on external. So we haven't even talked about the technology stack. So good luck with a CMS that doesn't integrate with Google Docs. You know, so we're talking about the kind of the front end of it. So I think that what's interesting about JCPA in America is that, you know, that big question, which is would journalism organizations form together to lobby, you know, against the bigger corporations, or do they, as Adrienne says, see themselves actually more in a relationship with the partnership? That, you know, they spend more time. I had a news editor saying to me, I spend more time talking to Apple's news team. No, we're not talking about Apple, but I spend more time talking to their news team than I do talking to other parts of my own organization. And they've been really effective. I think you're absolutely right, those bilateral deals. And one thing we've seen in the wake of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code is Google and Facebook going into territories where they think there's threat of legislation and signing big checks to sort of try and make potential legislation go away, to sort of switch the lobbying. What happens on the other side of this pressure? I don't know, because I think that my sense is the platforms are getting tired of actually interacting with the news industry. They don't feel they're getting very much out of it, and that you know, that Gilles' point about they're going to withdraw. I think that's not just going to be an empty threat. I think that's actually going to happen.
That might be happening. I mean, at least for Europe, we have to say, or for the European Union, that the strategy of handing over lots of money to prevent laws like the ancillary copyright, it kind of failed. There was 140 million euros in the DNI fund that was handed out to publishers in Europe, and still the publishers kind of lobbied so hard to make the ancillary copyright happen. I mean, time is running already short, and we cannot discuss those questions without looking at the question of journalistic independence and economic autonomy of the publishers. So this is one of the last questions I want to ask to you before we open up to the audience. Do you see like this all that we've been discussing here, is this kind of corrupting journalistic independence in some way? Because from our study that we did, Google the Media Patron, we saw that there, at least during the DNI, there was no case, not even rumors, that Google tried to use the DNI as a tool to influence articles on a micro level. But maybe we have to talk about a different kind of influence that comes with infrastructure and money. So what's your take on this?
I mean, it's soft power, so it's definitely effective. So we did some research where we went around and talked to people who were recipients of funding. And what was really interesting was we asked them a question which was, you know, why do you think the companies are doing this? And with only one exception, everybody said they're doing it basically to lobby. We know why they're doing it, but we still take the money anyway. But what was really interesting was when we asked the questions to the they tend to be Google newsrooms and tend to be Facebook newsrooms. You know, that actually the funding is kind of split in some ways, and they sort that out between themselves. But when you ask the Facebook newsrooms about what their general view of platforms were, they would say, you know, we know why they're giving us money, but, you know, we think that Facebook really get it, you know, and Google, they're terrible. Google newsrooms, exactly the opposite. So it does work, you know, it actually works that they have that sort of closer relationship and they're good at lobbying. And does it corrupt? You know, we have these discussions in newsrooms about advertisers all the time, but platforms have an access to the center of the newsroom that no advertiser has ever had. And I think that newsrooms are reluctant to look too closely at exactly what that relationship has done to their sort of independent thinking.
Okay. Oh, okay.
About the
okay.
I
don't know. So okay, I just want to add on that, but the independence. I think it doesn't really matter if it's impacting the journalism. I also heard that from all the media managers. The journalists told me, yeah, no, I mean, that has no impact on our reporting at all. But I mean, like, okay, why is there no reporting about these programs? So there's no reporting about it. That is already, I think, in my opinion, is wrong. Then second, why do the reporters don't have like the instinct of, why don't you want to figure out more about how is this selection process going on, like on behalf of Google? How do the decision makers at Google, who is deciding actually who gets money and not? Yep. And also, I think they also don't have the reflex to ask themselves that. That is also then, I think, a wrong development. And third, I think the problem is that right now there's a lot of discussion about regulation of big tech companies, and they should be under public scrutiny. And there is a regulation about, because of all the privacy scandals which has happened in the past, the security scandals which has happened in the past, also about all the data monopolies discussion right now. And so big tech should be not should not be the players funding their watchdogs. So I think this development now, I think is difficult because we should really look at, I mean, who is funding and what reporting is going to happen, and if there's no reporting about this kind of, if there's no transparency about these programs, who is funding what, then there's, yeah, I think in the long term, then we're really going to have a problem in journalistic independence, and also how does it affect the readers? So, yeah.
Maybe.
Agreed. Gilles, I'm sorry, you have to hold on to that thought for the last round. I have to ask, I have to open for
the audience.
I have to open up for the audience because otherwise we don't have time. So maybe, I guess we will have time.
Speak loud and we repeat the question.
Okay, we have a question regarding regulation, especially the European Union's approach with the Digital Services Act. What is to expect from that? I guess it would be easier if there's more questions or even comments. I mean, or your perspective. It doesn't have to be a question or comment. You can bring it in now. Otherwise, here. Okay. Blind spot.
My name is Gilles from the Netherlands. I'm curious to know, do you know of examples where the big publishing companies say they realize that by taking money from these companies, they may have an advantage in the short term, but in the long term, they may be signing their death sentence, to put it sharply. Are there examples of publishers saying that openly?
Okay, the question was repeating it for. I guess you heard it here in the room, but I'm repeating it for the stream, for the live stream audience. The question was if there's any publishers, bigger publishers, who admitted that it might have been a mistake, or that it might be taking funding from Google and Facebook might help them short term, but might be their death sentence in long term. Last chance for 1/3. Okay, yeah. Okay, what happens if Google and Facebook stop funding? Then
It's not just that, though. It's in terms of distribution stores, because most people obviously see content from Facebook and Google.
then Yandex is going to fill in, maybe. We had this yesterday. Okay, great questions. Yeah, no more questions. Thanks so much for those. Who wants to start with the question on regulation? We put it. We take that as a last question.
I was going to say the DSA is a European matter, so I should think...
He was asking especially explicitly for US for US.
Well,
US.
so actually the US is looking very carefully at the DSA, and I think that the really interesting thing about the DSA from a US perspective is that it enables Congress to think about legislating content distributors without running afoul of the First Amendment. So this idea of kind of assessment of harms and kind of evaluation and audit is something which helps US regulators. But US regulation, I have to tell you, everybody is talking about it, which nobody was talking about it 10 years ago. Everybody's talking about it. There are huge efforts around it. I don't know a single person who is really confident that any of the current legislation or antitrust moves, even though Lena Khan is now, who's actually sort of really dedicated to thinking about breaking up sort of big tech. Nobody thinks that any of this is necessarily going to work. But the European model is being looked at really closely.
My take on the DSA would be that we have to expect this to help for some problems we have with the platforms, like user autonomy about their news feeds and stuff. But I don't think they will. It doesn't really address the structural power imbalance that we've been discussing here. I don't expect this to change anything. Okay, second question was regarding the publishers. Did anyone say, okay, we made a mistake, or maybe this is going to be a long-term problem, although we took the money?
Yes, that's what I said in the beginning. So what I heard from the major news companies, they all told me like, yeah, we have now this fancy bot, moderating intelligence. Like, yeah, we created this project, this bot, we're not using it anymore, and basically, I don't even know if these tools and innovative projects are still online. And yeah, so that's the move I can say in Switzerland is basically we regret of doing it. But I mean, that is what they tell me. I don't know. I think they're still in conversation with Google and Facebook. But there I can say that, and yeah.
I'm taking the third question, what happens if they withdraw their funding, and combine it with my last question to this panel, because I wanted to ask as a last question, what would you advise, looking to the future, to publishers who want to sustain their autonomy or regain it in regarding with platforms? What are your advices strategically? Very short, I mean, we have 1 minute left, so like 30 seconds for each of you. your advice. Emily, you have to start.
Okay, very quickly, advice for publishers: if you're in a functioning democracy, then you should be pressuring your government for regulation around this, for transparency and ongoing support for smaller local publishers. And I think just globally, as a field, we need to continue to pressure all platforms to align their internal policies with supporting the free press in every single country that they operate in.
I couldn't say more. Yes, of course, we have to make more regulation and continue on that. Taking money, why not, but with regulations and with more transparency. And yes, maybe newspapers, they have the habit of we are together big newspapers, but they are not only the big newspapers. You have also the tiny newspaper and tiny groups and tiny websites, and all must have some help and some transparency about using big tech tools.
And I would just recommend change your business model. Easy said. I'm working for a magazine which is entirely reader funded, so it's a good example that's kind of working, and you have a lot of independency then. But yeah, so I think change your business model. But as long media publishers will rely on advertising, that this is not going to solve the problem. Also, the Digital Services Act, I think, as you said, won't change the underlying mechanisms and problem in that, because as long as data-driven advertising business models are in charge and the companies, the publishers are working with that, yeah, the problems will sustain, unfortunately.
All right. Then for me, it's just left to say thank you. It's like, okay,
thank
2
you
minutes
all.
after 1. I think it's all right. Thanks for the great panel. Thanks for the great questions and comments, and thanks for coming here. And again, thanks for the IJF for having us and for the generous sponsors to make this possible. Have a good day.